G'day painters, today we're working on my Mutalith Vortext Beast for my Thousand Suns. Let's get to it. Now if you're like me and avoid guides that use an airbrush, don't panic. I'm only using the airbrush for the two main base coat colours. This can easily be done with a brush, I just use the airbrush to save some time. For the Angel Green, you could also use an Angel Green rattle can from Army Painter. That's what I would do if I wasn't using my airbrush. Whichever way you decide to do it will work fine. The rattle can would be quickest, but a brush will work fine and it'll just take a bit longer. Then I used Ancient Stone to block in his chest area. As you can see, I'm terrible with an airbrush and there's a lot of overspray that'll need to be tidied up, but I still think it's quicker, and I'm lazy. And that's what the next step is. We're to the painting table now and it's tidying up all the overspray and finalising the break between the two colours. From this point forward it's all brushwork. Then I tidied up the Ancient Stone and that's the base coats for the two main colours done. But there are a couple of other colours to block in before we get to the fun highlighting. With Warlock Magenta, I blocked in all the inner parts of the tentacles, the grippy parts, I'm not really sure what to call them, but thankfully you can see what I'm painting. There's only one thing to block in after that, and it's the horns and spikes. As you can imagine, this is one of the longest steps. I'm starting from oak brown for the horns to make them look different to the chest. Both parts will be finished with similar colours, so starting from a darker base will help them stand apart from each other. After that slog, it was time to do some shading. I started with soft tone on the chest. I didn't want to do an all over wash here because I didn't want to darken it, so I'm just applying it manually to the recesses. I also did this on stream. I painted a fair bit of this model on stream, and the streams are still up and available. If you'd like to see more of this model being painted, check out the streams. And if you ever see me streaming, why not come hang out and chat while I paint? And if you were one of the people hanging out in the stream chatting, thanks. It was great to chat to you guys while I was painting. After doing the soft tone, I decided it was missing a bit of life to it, so I grabbed my Magenta Tone and went over the same spots as the soft tone with it. This gives that hint of red in the recesses that helps bring some life to the flesh. It was a minor change, but I feel like it had a big impact on the overall finish. Then with Ancient Stone, I went around and just touched up some spots where I made mistakes and got the washes in places I didn't want them. Then I started to highlight the chest. It's worth noting that a lot of the chest will be in shadow, so you don't want to highlight the parts that are facing downwards in shadows. Most of the highlights should be focused around the part that is exposed by his raised arm. Then it was pale sand for the final highlights for the chest, just picking out the most raised and exposed parts. Then it was back to Magenta Tone for the grippy tentacle bits. You can definitely do this when you're doing the Magenta Tone earlier, I just didn't think about it. For the green, I went with an all-over wash of Strong Tone. I thought about using a green wash here, but I wanted to darken it more than that, and I also feel like the brown wash gives it a bit more life than the green wash would. I was happy with the result, and I think it was the right decision. Then it was time for the longest step, starting the green highlights. With Guardian Green, I started working around the model, establishing the highlights. I wasn't being too careful about getting a smooth gradient here. I came back later and did some glazing to smooth it out. I did this part on stream, so if you want to watch me spend over an hour and a half working on the same green, you can. It's totally enthralling stuff. For the next green highlight, it was Greenskin. I work inside the highlights I established previously, focusing more towards the raised parts and the edges. Again, I wasn't being too careful about the gradient here, I smoothened it out with some glazing at the end. Then, for the final highlight on the most raised parts and edges, it was Eternal Hunt. This was a pretty quick step in relation to the previous two. Because I'm working in such small areas, it's nice, quick and easy. Then I highlighted the tentacle grippy bits with Spellbound Fuchsia. This part isn't actually glued together here yet. I blue tacked it so I could position the highlights properly, but I wasn't ready for it to be glued until after the spikes and all that stuff was done. Next, it was time to work on the goo on his tentacle face. I started with Hydra Turquoise to block it all in. You know what isn't gooey? The subscribe button. Don't be afraid to touch it and subscribe. I promise it's clean. I cleaned it this morning. I also cleaned the like button. It'd be a shame if you didn't hit that too. Then with Marine Mist, I work towards the ends of the dripping parts and the middle of the parts that have both ends connected. With a 50-50 mix of Marine Mist and White, I continued the previous step, working in smaller areas inside of the previous step. Now, I messed up here and I wasn't being careful and was letting my brush flick as I was doing it, which resulted in specks being flicked onto the other parts that need to be fixed up later. So don't be like me, take your time and be careful and save yourself some effort later. And I finished them off with white at the very tips or the very middle. I had no real plan for the gooey parts when I started doing them, but I really like how they came out and it's a recipe I'm going to remember for future projects that include this sort of thing. I then spent 5 minutes fixing up the mess I made in the previous steps. You could avoid this time if you're smarter than me. Learn from my mistakes. Time for the spiky bits. I started with Tomb King Tan. This is a big jump, but that's intentional. I want to get them to a pretty bright point at the end, but want them to look different to the tan on his chest. This also isn't a traditional highlight. I'm working more towards the end of all the spikes, leaving the parts closest to the body the brown. We will do some proper highlighting on it later, but this is more blocking in than highlighting. With Ancient Stone, I continued the spikes. This step I focused more towards the top like a traditional highlight, but going further down than you would normally. I did the same thing with this as I did with the green earlier, establishing where I wanted it, then coming back and doing some glazing to smooth it out later. Then pale sand is used for more of a traditional highlight, focusing along the edges and the tips. Any parts that would be sharper get hit with this, but leaning towards the side that is facing upwards. There are some knuckle parts as well as the hoofs that I left brown and hadn't done with the bone colours. These I wanted to leave brown, so with a 50-50 mix of fur brown and oak brown, I did some highlights on them to give some definition to. And that's the body and tentacle face done. Time for the power orby thing on his back. I'll be honest, I had no real plan here and was very much winging it. I had a vague idea of using my normal green flames, but beyond that I hadn't thought it through, and I was having decision paralysis, so I did what I always do when that happens and just picked a colour and started laying it down. And that colour was Triumphant Navy for the orb part. Then to start the flames I picked Enchanted Pink. I did all the raised flame parts on the orb itself, as well as the middle starting part of the larger flames. I hadn't totally settled on this yet, so I didn't worry too much about the transition. I knew I could smoothen it out a bit later. I decided the metallic looking part around the outside I would do as gold, using Retributor Armour. On the box art they have this as all the same colour as the flames and psychic power, but I didn't like that look, so I decided to try this instead. Then with white I went around and made sure all the flames were based white. When I was doing the gold it was hard to pick out what parts were flame and what were gold, and I went over a few parts that were meant to be flame. This part was hard as the flames are often not well defined, and it's going to come down to your preference on what parts you think should be flamed and what isn't. To continue the flames I broke out Daemonic Yellow. Leaving a section of white closer to the pink, I blocked in the rest of the flames. I'm still not caring about the transitions here, we'll fix them up later. Then I continued with Rainforest, following the previous step but leaving some yellow showing towards the white and some of the deeper parts. Greenskin is next, following our tried and true process here, leaving some of the previous steps showing while working towards the ends. Then I finish it off with Angel Green, focusing towards the tip of the flames. Deciding I was happy enough with this look, it was time to tidy up the transitions. This meant lots of glazing. I had all the colours on my palette and just worked between them to smoothen out any transitions I wasn't happy with. You could definitely do this as you do each colour, which is what I'd normally do too, but since I wasn't sure I'd be happy with it, I figured it'd be a waste of time doing it earlier if I decided to change my mind. With white, I worked around all the pink parts, picking out the edges. This helps break up the pink that was looking like just a big blob, and helps to find where the swelling power is starting to turn into the flames. This made a huge difference in how much I was liking the look of it. I was still not really sure if I liked it before this step. I'm still not 100% on it, even now I finished it, but this made it look a million times better. With strong tone, I did some shading on the gold. I'm being careful to miss the flames and pushing it where I want it, in the deeper recesses and the downwards facing parts. Though in hindsight, those parts wouldn't necessarily be in shadow since there are so many flames. While I waited for the wash to dry, I grabbed some Terrestial Titan, which is a very dark purple, and with a very thin down glaze, added some colour to the blue. It's hard to show on camera, but I went from the pink raised parts and made thick lines going away from it, showing the power isn't just appearing, but it's building up. That was the look I was going for anyway. I think I hit that mark, but you really don't see it unless you're looking for it. Then with Warlock Magenta, I added thinner lines inside the ones I established previously, showing the power building up more. Honestly, you could easily skip these two steps and your model wouldn't really suffer for it. Most people that look at your model will never notice it. Finally, it's time to highlight the gold. I start with bright gold, focusing on the sharp edges and the parts facing upwards. Finishing it with an edge highlight of Mithril Silver. And it's done. 13 hours really didn't feel too bad for a model that's going to be a major centerpiece of my army. I know many people will feel that's too much time, but I'm comfortable with that time and I think it was well worth it. I'm 100% happy with how his body came out. I think that looks great. I'm still not completely sold with the power orb on his back. I may revisit this sometime in the future, but for now I'm calling him done. He has made it to the table for a game already, and he definitely looks amazing on the table, which is the point really. If you've made it this far, surely you've enjoyed the video, so I'd be grateful if you gave it a like. If you've enjoyed the video and want to see more from me, hit that subscribe button too. Thanks for watching, catch you in the next video.